Awesome. Thank you. My name is Stacia Stribling. I am the Training and Administrative Coordinator at Formed Families Forward, and I'm joined today with Kelly Henderson, who is our Executive Director. And the two of us will be fielding questions and sort of supporting the webinar. And before we get started, Kelly is going to drop into the chat in case you have not yet seen it. We would appreciate if you would fill out a quick 5-question pre-test. It's not really a test. You don't need to stress out over it, but some 5 questions about speech and language development that we're going to ask you beforehand and then ask you again at the end of this session. So if you could please click on that link and make sure you have done that. And before we turn it over to Beth, I did want to introduce you all to Formed Families Forward. If you have not yet joined us for a webinar, and tell you a little bit about us. We are a family-led nonprofit organization. We're located in Northern Virginia. And our primary goal is to support foster, adoptive, and kinship families who are raising children, youth, and young adults with special needs.
In the freezer is a box of hamburger patties.
We also work with professionals who support those families. So the different services that we offer are free trainings. We give free consultations to families if you are having specific issues that you would like assistance with and need some additional resources. You can reach out to us through our website. We have some events, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those coming up, resources and peer support groups, webinars, some virtual trainings. And we are a proud partner to the Virginia Tiered System of Supports, or VTSS, which is a project with the Virginia Department of Education. If you are attending this session live tonight, then you are eligible for a certificate of attendance. If you would like that at the end of this webinar, please send an email to myself, and Kelly is going to drop that email in the chat. It is stacia.stribling@formedfamiliesforward.org. So just to give you a heads up about some of our upcoming events, next Wednesday, March 6th, we are having a webinar on transitioning to adulthood, options and resources from panel experts. We're going to have some folks answer some questions about what that looks like when our kids are finishing up that high school experience and moving on to higher ed training or workforce. So please join us for that. There's the link to register. And on Wednesday, May 8th, we are having the who, what, when, where, and why, understanding foster care in Virginia. Now, some of you who are in here may already be part of that system, but that does not mean you don't have questions about how all of that works, because it can be kind of confusing. So please join us for that webinar on May 8th. And Kelly right now is dropping those 2 registration links into the chat in case you're interested in those. And both of those are in the evening, 7 to 8. You'll notice we did not have a webinar planned for April. That's because April is going to be our big face-to-face event. We've got our Spring Forward Foster, Adoptive, and Kinship Family Fun Day. And this is geared specifically for foster, adoptive, and kinship families, as well as the professionals that may work with those families. That event is on Saturday, April 13th. It's going to be from 8:30 to 2 at the GMU Science and Tech Campus in Manassas. We are so excited to welcome Jessica Sonarski. She's an author and a trauma expert who will be giving our keynote address that day called Reignite Your Why. She is a very inspirational speaker. And if you haven't checked out any of her books, she's written the whole Riley the Brave series. So we're so excited that she is able to join us that day. After the keynote, caregivers are going to be able to attend some other breakout sessions, and we have fun activities planned for the kids. So please be sure to register for that. And Kelly is also dropping that link into the chat. We also offer something called Learning Your Way, which is an online learning portal that's go at your own pace. We've got courses on special education, trauma, dispute resolution, communication, other health impairments. And there is the link to register for Learning Your Way, which is free of charge. That is a free online course. We also offer some support groups. Right now, we're running our Stronger Together Youth Peer Support Group, which is for youth and young adults ages 14 to 22. We have 2 sessions left of that this winter, but then we hope to run this group again in the fall. And this is a clinician-led. You do not need to be a foster, adoptive, or kinship youth in order to attend this. This is open to all youth and young adults who may want to be part of this support group. But we also have a support group for caregivers that is specifically for adoptive, foster, and kinship caregivers. And this meets actually twice a month. The first Sunday of each month is virtual, and the third Wednesday is in person in our office in Fairfax. And this is led by our trained Form Families Forward staff, and Kelly is dropping the link for registration into the chat for this. This is a great opportunity to connect with other caregivers, to get some assistance, and just to kind of have that bond with other folks who are walking that road with us. And finally, at the end, we are going to ask that you complete an evaluation, and we're going to drop that in the link in the chat at the very end of this session. These are super important for us because it allows us to see what additional resources you may be looking for, what other types of webinars might be helpful, and gives us some help on the experience and some insight into the experience that you had this evening. Again, certificates are only for those who attended the live session, and you can request those by emailing me. Email addresses there. And of course, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and keep up with our website because we have some tremendous resources there as well. All right, Kelly, is there anything that I am forgetting before I introduce Beth?
No, other than I want to really encourage folks to please register for Spring Forward Family Fun Day if you're interested. We're in a great position of being able to be a little closer to our limit on the number of kiddos that we can register because it's been very well received. So we want you to make sure to register early. And we do anticipate that there will be scholarships for much of the cost of the youth who participate. So there's more information online about that, but there is an opportunity to have a little bit of a savings for the youth and young adults who and children who participate in our programming. And finally, I am going to include in the chat box the link to this session's webpage. Where Beth's slides are going to be available to you. So don't worry, you can download those, and then following the webinar tonight, there'll be a recording at that same URL, same web page. So that's it.
Awesome. And I will tomorrow be emailing you with that landing page again. So if you don't capture it here, I will send that to you tomorrow via email. All right, I am so excited to introduce today's presenter. This is Beth Stribling, and she is a speech and language pathologist. Also happens to be my sister-in-law. Yes, that same name is not a coincidence. And she has helped me more than I can say with my own children and their development. So I'm so excited that she's here to share her knowledge with us. She started her work in private rehab and then did some work at Children's Hospital in Richmond as well. So she has a background in that medical model of speech and language development. Then she worked for a while as a speech pathologist with Fauquier County Public Schools, and she has now started her own private practice called Something to Say Speech and Language Therapy. And so we are so excited to have you here. Welcome, Beth, and I will let you take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacia. It's good to be here. I look forward to sharing things about what I love to do, what I love the most. So I think we had talked earlier that the questions, you guys can ask questions at the end. So I'm just going to kind of run through and talk about what I put this presentation together about. So The first thing I wanted to kind of share and go into briefly is what a speech language pathologist does. So before talking about how we can help our littles and even our older children with their speech and language development. Sorry, keep going. Okay. Sorry, I got some feedback there. Anyway, I wanted to let you guys know what it is actually that a speech language pathologist does, because it's a pretty big range of things that we cover. Although most, well, not most, but there are a lot of people who are like, oh, it's the speech lady or the speech teacher, especially when you're in the schools, right? So speech is definitely something that we do, but language and other disorders are as well. So we kind of put a little list here for you on speech disorders, what that looks like, what we treat and diagnose, which is articulation, phonology, apraxia, fluency, and voice. And then with language disorders, that can be receptive language, it can be expressive language, it can be pragmatic language, which is social communication. Other disorders that we work with are children that have hearing loss, children who have oral motor disorders, and swallowing and feeding. So that's kind of the least known thing that we do. Not a lot of people automatically think of a speech language pathologist as working on swallowing, but that's quite an important job that we do as far as covering little ones who are on NG tubes or G tubes or having their nutrition via tube rather than mouth. And also kids who have a hard time chewing or swallowing. So do a little bit of everything. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was oh yes, sorry, I was reading the slide thinking, what was the what questions should you ask a speech pathologist? So let's say you have concerns and you have been referred by your pediatrician or someone else, and you are going to see a speech language pathologist. It's really important to know what to ask. And I say this as someone who's worked in all of the fields that you can work in, as far as the hospital, the school, and private practice. We're all speech language pathologists, but we all have different backgrounds and experiences and specialties, kind of. I will say specialties because some people kind of will emphasize their continuing education and where they continue their education in certain areas. So I would ask them specifically before you start receiving services or get the evaluation, these questions. What age group do you work with? What age and specific area are your specialties? How quickly can you see my child? What are methods of payment and funding? And is there a wait list for treatment? Are you certified and are you licensed by the state? Most importantly, is the licensure, the state licensure. You want to make sure that you're seeing someone who has their state licensure. I think these are some questions that you can ask while you're with the therapist that you may not think of when you're in there with her. Things that you can ask about not just what you're seeing with your child at home, but what the bigger picture looks like for your child after she has had a chance or he has had a chance to evaluate your child. So the next thing, first of all, I think Kelly may have said that these slides will be available to you. So if we're going through them kind of fast, do not worry, because you'll have access to them and you can kind of go back and read those questions and you'll have those on hand as well. The next portion of this webinar we wanted to talk about was developmental milestones. So knowing, and one of the things that we talked about in the title obviously was how to nurture communication, how to help your child grow in that area. So we kind of have to know what the milestones are in order to do the right things. It's not uncommon to expect more or less of our children if we don't have a range of skills that we should be looking for. So I've included in here speech sounds by age, because as a speech therapist, that is obviously one thing that we will work on. Helping children develop their sounds and using them in words and phrases and sentences and conversation. I like to refer to this chart with families that I'm working with because they will often say, oh, I noticed that they're not using their R sound yet, and it may be a 3-year-old. And you'll see here on this chart that R sound, 90% of children have it by the age of 6. So I, as a speech therapist, look at that and think, oh, okay, that's fine. That sounds probably still emerging. They're not developmentally there yet, but that doesn't mean that there's a disorder or even really a delay. So I also like this chart because it kind of gives you a range of sounds. Like you see that the B, the N, the M, the P, the H, there's several sounds that by 3 years, we're like, yes, those are solid sounds. They should be in place. So I like to give this to parents so that they can kind of have that to refer to when they're looking and thinking, oh, I wonder if my child should be saying this sound at this time. The one thing that I always caution parents too, if you do have questions, if you're like, well, they're making a sound that a 5-year-old should make, but they're not making a sound that a 3-year-old should make, and they're 4 years old, right? Consult with a speech language pathologist because there could be more going on. We look at the bigger picture. We look at other sounds as well as just the age appropriate sounds. So the next slides actually will go into developmental milestones. This is a handout that I often give families. I work with the birth to 3 population, the early intervention for Rappahannock, Rapidan. And a lot of times, people are, when we meet with them, we're like, well, what are your concerns? And what would you like to see your child doing? And a lot of times families are like, I really don't know what they're supposed to be doing at the age of 2, or is this good, or is this good? So I like to provide developmental milestones that give a range of skills so that you can see 2 to 3, that's a whole year. 1 to 2, that's a whole year, right, of development. And there's a range of skills. And some children on the very, first birthday have a ton of words, right? Some of them might have like 10 words. And then there are other children who at 18 months are just getting 10 words. But that's still considered average. So the range of average is pretty big. And what I like to do is just say, we're targeting these things, right? This is what we're looking for. And it doesn't have to be first and then, and at this month, this is going to happen. So you're just kind of following the guidelines and kind of having an idea of at least within that year. So the first slide is about birth to 3 months, 4 to 6 months, 7 to 9, and 10 to 12. These are just a few things that I picked out to put on the slide, but there is a PDF that is attached to this presentation, and you guys will have access to that as well. And the PDF has a front that shows what the milestones are, and then it also has a back. It'll be 2 pages rather. The second page has recommendations, things that you can be doing with your child during those months and that year of development to encourage growth and to facilitate growth in those areas of their development. So birth to 3, you'll see they're just basically, making sounds and being alert to sounds, cooing. This is when they start to recognize mom and dad. And 4 to 6 months, they start to use their voice a little more purposefully, and they're responding to you when you're smiling at them, and they're making noises with their mouth, blowing raspberries. 7 to 9 months, they become a little bit more aware of language is growing, and they can often look towards you when you're talking to them and calling their name. They will raise their arms if they're sitting on the floor to be picked up. You're starting to hear more consonant sounds. And then you have that 10 to 12-month-old that is pointing and waving and trying to imitate sounds and maybe saying 1 or 2 words. The next slide is what can you do to help? So these are things that you can be doing during those months to really focus on, okay, this is how I can engage them in a way that nurtures their language development, their communication. So always responding to them when they're using their voice to get your attention, or even if they're using it in play, respond, interact, make the sounds back to them, make silly faces, laugh at them. They'll start to laugh back at you. Teaching them to copy actions, peekaboo, clapping, blowing kisses. That is, we often talk about the prerequisite skills for talking, right? And turn taking is a talking skill. It's a conversational skill. So teaching them turn taking with imitation in games is how they learn that concept. This is when they start to learn animal sounds. So children will often name the animal's sound before they'll name the animal. So being silly, making the animal noises when you see animals, when you're looking at pictures and books, and when you're playing with animals with them at home, they're toy figurines. Always singing, telling stories, or reading. I think, reading to your child every day is so important. And the vocabulary that they're exposed to that they might not be to in just an average day at home. Expanding their vocabulary in that way is important in all ages of development. So can't speak enough about reading to your kids. Sorry. So I think the next slide would probably be 13 to 19 months. So starting to really understand more language, starting to understand when you say, "Where is it?" or following very simple directions of things that they are very familiar with. So if you're playing with a ball and you're going to hold your hands out and you're going to say, "Give me the ball," and they're going to understand that they're going to give you the ball. Using gestures, high-fiving, getting excited and clapping, and spontaneously, not just imitatively. Understanding words for common objects that they have, like I was saying with the ball. Give me the ball. They're familiar with the ball. It could be a doll baby. It could be a truck. It could be blocks. It could be their cup. This is the age where they start to give you things, sometimes not just when you request, but to give that to you, to call your attention to it. They're starting to say no and yes by shaking their head and nodding, pointing to get your attention to look for things. And using more sounds and some real words, some more real words at this time. And then, of course, identifying body parts. And again, this is just a handful of the developmental skills that I've chosen to put on here on this slide, but not all of them would fit. So please look at the handouts that are attached to this presentation.
And those handouts, just to clarify, will be on the landing page. They're not up there just yet. It's just the PowerPoint. But by tomorrow, those handouts will be there as well.
All right, 19 to 24 months. This is when we see the vocabulary really starting to grow. So they're starting to use real words and less just sounds, right? So that babbling starts to turn into actual words. Not always clear, but typically this is the stage where the mom understands it, or whoever's spending the most time. Dad understands it. A caregiver who's with them the majority of time will say, "Oh, they just said shoe," or "They just said dog." That's how they say dog. So it's a word that they repeat consistently, and it has not, the intelligibility hasn't reached its fullest potential yet, because motorically they're not able to put the sounds together yet. They're starting to put two words together. They're starting to follow two-step directions and understanding words like me, mine, and you. And anyone who has a toddler right now would be very familiar with those words, the me, mine, you, especially the mine. And they're starting to ask for help. So during this phase of their development, again, talking to them. I know this is kind of probably seems like a really silly thing to say to some of us. Well, of course, we're talking to our children, but some of us, not me, are kind of quiet and reserved by nature, and could probably spend an entire day not talking. That is, that's not uncommon. I work with many families where I go into the home and I'm talking and I'm reading and I'm being silly and I'm doing all of the things to get their child talking. And the mom is like, "Wow, that exhausts me." And and I say, I'm a speech therapist. I'm supposed to be kind of over the top, right? I'm exaggerating things to really engage your child. But that's not how I interacted with my children at this age all day long. But I did talk to them, and I did read to them, and I did sing to them. And those are things, if you can't think of anything to talk about, you can at least read and sing, right? You can find songs to sing with them. So letting them hear you and interact with you in a way that uses your voice. Giving them directions, having them become more independent, telling them, "Hey, you do this, get the ball." Having them point to pictures. "What do you see?" "I see the car." "Can you point to the car?" Pointing to body parts is a big one that people like to target. That helps with safety, right? And hurt. Where does it hurt? And identifying the body parts is often something that families will target more often, easily, for whatever reason, but it is also something that is used to help them understand what's going on in their body, like if they're sick. So yeah, that's some of the things you can do at that age to start getting that language going. 2 to 3. Now they're using word combinations. They're saying their name when you ask them. They're using some plurals. So they're understanding the concept of more than one and marking the word so that it shows more than one. They're starting to use verbs, present progressive ing verbs like eating or running, and they're starting to ask questions. So again, if you have a child at this age or you have recently, you're familiar with the why. And sometimes they don't even really care why. So, but they'll ask it anyway, just because it's part of the development. They're learning, oh, I can ask a question and you answer it. Like all the times you're asking me, you're telling me. So this age of language development and communication skills is one of my favorite, because it really is like such, I feel like week to week, it can change so much. And it's a really cool time to watch them learn and be able to show you and tell you what they've learned. So the next is 3 to 4. They're comparing things. So they're starting to understand and use concepts like bigger and shorter, smaller. They start to tell you stories. Sometimes at this age, the speech can still be at 3, about 75% intelligible. So there may be stories that you get 75% of, still responding to them, right? Understanding their story, engaging in that story with them. They're starting to use all of the syllables in a word and saying the sounds at the beginning, middle, and end of words. So that should be a process that we see developing at this age pretty solidly. And then they're speaking at the age of 4, they're speaking so that most people can understand most of what they say. So between 3 and 4, we see a pretty significant increase in intelligibility. By 4, most kids, they may have some sound errors that are still emerging, but for the most part, they're intelligible to anyone that they speak to, even if it's an unfamiliar adult. Things that we can do during those ages, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, the same thing, read, sing, and talk, right? This is where we start to get into pretend play and using our imagination, understanding how other people talk. So they're role playing and changing their voices and playing different characters. You want to read simple stories at this point too, where they can then tell you. This is a really fun age where I can recall with my own boys, they would go through a book that I had read with them many times, and they would tell me the story back. And so you want to read something that they can grasp in a way that they can then turn around and tell you that story, not verbatim, not word for word, but the concepts that they've learned from that. They're starting to understand categories and being able to categorize things and sort them. So that's a fun age, because you start to see some of that problem solving really start to show up as well. And that those are things that you can do with them. Sorry, I got off track with talking about what they can do. You do those things with them, and it facilitates that growth. So that's all about the development up until the age of 4, or 5, 4, sorry. And the things that you can do. And I'm happy to answer questions when we get to the end of this as well about other things if you have any questions. Then I wanted to go into a little bit about delay versus disability. Because that can be a common misunderstanding when we're working with children. So I always say, if you have a doubt, meet with an SLP, get a referral, find an SLP that you have vetted and trust, and ask your questions. Is there more going on? Oftentimes I have found myself, I actually just recently did some screenings at a preschool, and I'm just having conversations with parents, right? I'm having, based on what I saw in the screening, and the parents are like, well, I was wondering about this, and this is different. That their brother didn't do this when he was that age. And should I be worried about this? And sometimes parents just need to hear someone who's trained to look at the child in a certain way and get that information. And that's all they need. And you don't need anything more, right? But at least consulting with an SLP so that you can know if there is a concern. Stacia, what was the next slide? I want to make sure I don't get off topic here. Okay. Before we go into the pragmatic language, I did want to talk a little bit about, because I pointed out delay versus disability. A speech language pathologist should be looking at the whole child, not just the speech, not just the language. So for instance, something that is considered selective mutism, right? So that can often be categorized as a speech disorder. However, yes, a speech language pathologist does play a role in that. But if a child comes to me and they have been diagnosed by their pediatrician with selective mutism, I immediately ask who the counselor that they referred to is, what mental health professional is working with the child as well. Because that speech language support that I would be providing to the child, that is not a speech language disability. That is part of a bigger disability, and speech language is negatively impacted by the mental health disability that is occurring. So I point that out because sometimes, because of that first slide, when I say, oh, we do this and we do this and we cover this and we can treat that too, the speech language pathologist can be the catch-all. And sometimes it's really important to recognize that we are part of a team that can provide the services, but shouldn't be the only person providing the services. So again, like if it's a child who has experienced trauma and they have significant anxiety, or this is going to lead us into the pragmatic language behaviors that look like a communication disability, we have to step back and look at the root cause. What's going on? Is this a speech language disability by nature, or is this a result of something else that's going on? And a speech language pathologist can address it in therapy in collaboration with other professionals. There are speech language disabilities that completely stand alone, that there's nothing else to target, right? So for instance, apraxia or a phonological disorder, it truly is a motor planning issue where the child has difficulty. They know what they're saying, but the signal from the brain to the mouth is not what they think it is, right? So if they're thinking a word and it comes out completely different because the motor planning is impaired, that is a speech language disorder that's not associated with any other kind of learning disability or any other neurological problem. So I wanted to kind of put a little emphasis on that, because sometimes I think it's really important as a parent, when you're seeking out services, to make sure that the person who is providing services to your child is looking at the bigger picture. You really want someone who's not just looking at their area of specialty, but is willing to say, you know what, there could be more going on here, so let's pull in other professionals. Speaking about the behavior and how that can impact language development led me into this. And this is a really important conversation that I have with many families, and I've had it in my own family. The pragmatic language, the social communication. So pragmatic language disorder is a condition in which someone has difficulty communicating verbally and non-verbally in social situations. So it's all about the social interactions. It's all about how we are behaving with our language, if you will. And I put here, communication deficits may lead to behavioral challenges, and behavioral deficits may lead to communication challenges. There is, in all of my years of practice, this has been a common question, a common statement, a common misunderstanding. Unfortunately, it often is a misunderstanding, but people will say, oh, they are having so much frustration and this maladaptive behavior because they can't communicate, because they're not communicating appropriately. And one example I can give you that's not necessarily maladaptive behavior, but is tantruming, right? That kind of inappropriate behavior of a 3-year-old, or a 2-year-old rather. Let's go with a 2-year-old who, and this is something that I see in my early intervention population. A child might be working with another therapist, and that therapist comes to me, another like occupational therapist or physical therapist, and the mom wants a speech language evaluation. And so we're talking about it and teaming how, what's going on and how can I help? And then I'm meeting with the family, and I hear the therapist even say, they're throwing tantrums a lot. There's a lot of behavior, and it's because they can't tell their mom what they want. And so I'm like, okay, At 2, I would kind of expect some bad behavior, right? Like what we perceive as bad behavior, because developmentally, that's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to tantrum. That's the way their brain is wired. And then I work with the family and I see the child walk over to the mom and grab her shoulder or, her sleeve and point over to the counter and say a string of syllables. And some of them might sound like words and some of them might not. And then he pulls her over to the counter and she says to him in conversational manner, "It is not time for a lollipop. You may not have a lollipop today." So she knew exactly what he wanted. He took her to it. He pointed to it. He used an excited face because he was ready to have it. And she said no. And he literally falls out on the floor and kicks his feet, right? Very typical behavior for a 2-year-old. But that was not a communication problem in the least. He communicated beautifully with his mom. In fact, so much so that she intuitively knew exactly what he was saying and responded to him like, "No, we're not having a lollipop." So that is how sometimes that can be misunderstood. The flip side of that can be a child who, I think I was talking with you, Stacia, about something called alexithymia, and that is something that's very common in children who have autism, and it's an inability to understand and then describe the feelings they have. So there's this, in our sensory system, one of the senses is interoception. So it's an understanding of like, I feel sad, I feel nervous, I feel embarrassed, I feel guilty, and then being able to name those things. So you have a child who does something impulsively, perhaps, or accidentally, and they feel embarrassed or guilty, but they don't understand that feeling and they don't know how to identify it. They just know it's a different energy inside of them. And then the person who's helping work through this with them, the adult, says, "How did you feel?" And they say, "I don't know." Well, tell me about the situation when you were doing that situation. Did you feel like this, or when this happened, did you think this? I don't know. I don't know. And so that can be perceived as refusal to participate in the conversation. That can be perceived as behavior, like this child's not cooperative during counseling sessions or, when working with the teacher because they're not answering the questions. When in reality, that's a bigger problem. That's a communication problem. That's a self-awareness problem. So, and it leads to pragmatic difficulties. So I use those 2 examples just to kind of show how we can often understand. The next one. Oh, how does an SLP help with pragmatic language? So, again, as I stated before, we are part of a team, always should be part of a team. Meaning when I'm working on pragmatic language, my role is to teach the concepts. So a child who does not understand, if I'm working with a small group of children and one child gets really close to the other kid's face, and every time he sits down, he sits right on top of them, and he's like all in his space, that child may not understand that there are social boundaries. He has no idea that there's a bubble that he has to put around himself, an invisible bubble that other people don't like him in his space. So I teach that kind of concept. Hey, let's talk about physical bubbles. Figurative language is a really big one with our social language. We, as English speakers, use so many idioms and figurative language without even realize it. We use it all the time. And it can often look like the child, when they don't understand it or they're doing something, is understanding it because they're intelligent and they understand lots of things, but because they didn't understand that and they respond in a certain way, that they're misbehaving. An example of this is my own son was playing baseball, and he's a very intelligent boy. And so, his baseball coach adores him, and he's practices and does all the things. And at one point he was in the outfield and the coach said, "Get on your toes, like be on your toes, boy." And he got up on his toes. Like he literally in his cleats was like, kept getting on his toes and falling back. And my husband was like, "Oh my gosh, like, I can't believe he's doing that. Like being smart against the, like kind of being a smart aleck to the coach." And I was like, no, he's actually not being a smart aleck to the coach. He has no idea what that phrase meant. So when we got in the car and we were driving home, I was like, "Hey, bud, I heard coach tell you, get on your toes. What did he mean by that? And he said, I have no idea why he wanted me on my toes. So that's the kind of stuff that we will overlook sometimes. And we think, like, his behavior kind of looked like he was being a little smart aleck tween, right? Like, I'm going to mock my coach by getting on my toes, but he wasn't. So we have to pay attention to those types of things. So as an SLP, I teach those things, right? So I teach children to kind of dig deeper and think about the things that are being said to them. If they don't understand them, if they don't make sense in that context, to try to think about it and teach those things. Perspective taking. Okay, let's think about that person. He just fell and there were lots of kids around him and they giggled when he fell. How do you think he felt? And then most importantly, collaborating with mental health professionals, because rarely, if you have a pragmatic language disability, is that the only thing that's going on, right? So I can teach a child all the social rules and boundaries, and I can teach them figurative language and perspective taking. But if they are in fight or flight, if they are in a moment of impulsive choice making, if they are anxious, that's all out the door. That is not something that they're thinking about. They're not thinking, oh, I really need to work hard on keeping my personal bubble right now. That's not something they have access to. So that's where the mental health professional comes in when it comes with social language, how to help them find coping skills to keep them out of fight or flight, and then recovering when they come out of it. So that was it about my pragmatic language. I could go on and on and on, but I know I only have a little bit of time. These are places to go if you have concerns with your child's speech and language. If they are in the ages between birth and 3, you can reach out to your early intervention organization that's in your area. I am in Fauquier County, so mine is the Rappahannock Rapidan Early Intervention, and they will provide services to your child in your home up until the age of up until the age of 3. The public school is also a place where you can go to have your child evaluation. You would evaluated. You can contact the special education department of whatever school system you are in. Your child is eligible to be assessed by the school at the age of 2. And then, so there's a gap. There's a period of time that's an overlap, actually. Early intervention can serve you up to 3. The school can pick you up at 2. My recommendation is always to stay with early intervention as long as you can, because at that age, the parents, the families, the caregivers, the early intervention system is targeting the entire family, right? They're talking to the family about how to nurture these skills and help the development in that area. And the school often provides services in the school system, in the base school. And then, of course, local pediatric outpatient rehab centers. Most of your local hospitals will have a pediatric rehab. There are lots of local pediatric rehab centers. And then, obviously, there's lots of little private practices like myself in areas. So those are places, if you're feeling concerned, just Google. Oftentimes, a lot of people are telling me that they found me on Google and they just went through and looked at my website, or they've been referred by somebody else that knew me. So word of mouth is often pretty powerful too. Most of the time you get the best information from other parents who've experienced similar journeys to you and what resources they used. All right. Am I good on time? Questions?
That timing was absolutely perfect.
Thank
we like to
you.
leave 15 minutes for questions. So that was fantastic. And I will check with Kelly if there's anything in the chat, or if you have not had a chance to put a question in the chat, if you want to do so now, or you can unmute yourself if there's something specific that you would like to ask.
We do have a question. And this, I think you mentioned the feeding therapy when you talked about some of the many services that SLPs can provide. So the question is, what are the differences between a speech language pathologist and an OT for feeding therapy?
Good question. So there can be a gray area there. And I will tell you that I co-treat a lot with occupational therapists on feeding. And if I am involved and an occupational therapist is involved, more often what we're looking at is the occupational therapist, we say, tries to get it into the mouth, right? And we try to get it from the mouth into the stomach. So the occupational therapist is working on the sensory piece of what foods I will touch, what foods I'll smell, what foods I can tolerate, because a lot of children have sensory deficits that need feeding therapy because they won't even put it to their mouth. So the sensory integration piece is the occupational therapist. Also the fine motor piece of actually holding a spoon, holding a fork, finger, using your pincher grasp to get the food off of the tray or plate into your mouth. The speech language pathologist is more aligned with the oral motor control. How do I move the muscles of my mouth to then chew and manipulate the food and swallow it? So that's a lot of what I'm doing when I'm co-treating with an OT. So the swallow, the chew, sucking, swallowing, chewing, moving the mouth and the jaw. Did that answer the question, you think?
Well, if it didn't, I hope they let me know in the chat or just shout out. I don't have any other direct chats, so I want to, Stacey, if you want to take a look around and see if anybody has questions. Maybe we want to drop the slide view. There we go. So Beth, while people think about their question and get ready to ask it, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the uniqueness of getting just speech therapy services at school and sort of how that works within special education. Often, in my experience, children from early intervention come in with multiple needs, enter into the school system, and many, not all, of course, but many resolve some of their more physical or sensory issues, but still retain the need for speech language therapy. So can you talk a little bit about what that might look like in those preschool and even into elementary school years?
Of course, yeah. So a lot of times, the preschoolers are eligible for speech language services as a child with a speech language impairment that has been identified as meeting the criteria for such through the special education department. So if you come into the school with your child and you have a 3-year-old and they test, the special ed team tests and they find them eligible for speech language impairment only, then chances are that 3-year-old is then going to go into their home-based school to meet with the speech therapist and receive speech therapy once or twice a week. The parent takes them and then brings them home. They don't participate in a classroom. If there's more going on and the team assesses the child and they have a developmental disability, meaning they've gone through the criteria, they've been assessed, they've gone through the criteria worksheet, they find them delayed in all of development, then they may be eligible for an early childhood special education classroom. And that is for children, they can go in as early as 3 and then they stay until kindergarten. And that is like any other self-contained special education class, there's a limit on how many kids can be in there, and they typically have 4. They can have up to 4 typical peers. If a child is elementary school age and they're just getting speech language therapy, then they would have an IEP for that. And the speech language pathologist would get them from their class or whatever part of their day that they agree on with the teacher, and usually see them in a small group with other kids, targeting whatever they have determined needed to be addressed through their assessment. And then goals were written in the IEP. Did you have any specific questions about like the difference between a child who has just speech and other disabilities, or just that? Did I address what you were thinking?
I think you addressed it. It does. I think sometimes we get folks calling us and contacting us and Form Families Forward that they're not sure sort of what their status is just because their child is only getting speech language language services.
Okay. Yeah. So they have an IEP, they have special education services, but they're limited to a speech language impairment, not a learning disability or something that requires any other level of interventions. And that's typically a child who has an articulation disorder. That's the most common speech. We call them speech only kids in the schools. Artic is the most common for that, because if it's a language disorder, more often than not, it's a learning disorder that needs to be addressed by a special educator, not just a speech language pathologist.
I've got a question here, Beth, which is perfect for you. What is a speech therapist role in getting speech assistance devices?
Oh, that's
One of
my
your
favorite
areas of
topic.
specialty. Yes.
That is my passion. If I could only do what we call augmentative alternative communication all day, every day, that's what I would love. But I have to stay well-rounded, right? So no, that is an area that I love, and I am more than happy to talk about that all day. A speech language pathologist should, so if this is something if you're considering, you need to know this. A speech language pathologist should evaluate and work with the child before making a recommendation on what kind of communication device the child would benefit from. You can do that in the school system. In Fauquier County, we have all of our SLPs have an iPad with multiple communication apps that they are supposed to be trialing in their intervention with the children that they provide services to. And then at some point, if they say, you know what, this child is doing amazing with this particular app in therapy and in the classroom, because they are allowed to have that app in the classroom, Fauquier County is then responsible for providing that iPad with that app to that child to take to and from school. It belongs to them while they are a student in the county. If it is a private therapist, that private therapist can write a letter of medical necessity to the insurance. And then most insurances will pay a large portion of it. And it will be covered by insurance and it be under warranty. That speech language pathologist, huge problem that I see is that you will often take your child for a AAC assessment. They recommend a device and send you on your way. And then you show up to school with your personal device that you got from UVA, and that speech language pathologist is like, I've never used this device. So make sure there's not that disconnect. If you're getting recommended a speech language pathologist is recommending a certain device for you, then make sure you're getting follow-up services with that therapist or a therapist that knows how to use that app or that device and can train the family on how to use it as well. More often than not, I hate to admit it, but if that happens, the child does not become a successful AAC user because the families, it's not a natural way of communicating, right? I mean, you're adding a whole other component. And so it's really important to involve the caregivers in how to use that. Hopefully that answered that question.
So there's another question here, Beth, and so about a 22-month-old that has been in speech therapy for 3 months. Still isn't saying words or mimicking sounds, but comprehension skills and following directions is improving. At what point should we have concerns if they're in therapy that they're still not saying words?
That's a tricky question without knowing the child. I would say ask, when I mentor speech language pathologists, I will say to them, if you cannot explain what you're working on and why you're doing it with a child, then you shouldn't be doing it. So every action or word that I speak or use when I'm working with a child, I will clarify for the parents. I'm doing this because this is what I'm hoping to see. I'm doing this because I want you to do this to help with this. So if your therapist is not doing that, ask your therapist, what are we working on here? What's going on? Do you see any progress? And I will tell you too, oftentimes I will go into the home and I usually see the ITC kids every other week. And every now and then the family will cancel a visit. So it'll be like 4 weeks and I'll come in and I'll say, what's changed? What can you, tell me what's new? And they'll say, not much really. And then about 20 minutes into that visit, they're like, oh, and now, oh my gosh, just the other day, he said this 3-word phrase and you wouldn't believe how he's talking to the sister now. And so these things start to come out. So you're not always, as the parent, seeing what's happening. So then I get to say to the family, guess what? There is a lot to report. And as a mom, you're living it day to day and you don't even think to measure it, right? So I think that's my job as a speech language pathologist, is to point out what gains are being made. If there are no gains being made in a 3-month period, you said receptive language skills are growing. It is often the case that receptive language skills will grow faster than expressive language skills. And at 22 months is a really tricky age to define anything like apraxia, like a motor planning disorder, because they're not making that many sounds yet anyway. But but yeah, I mean, I don't want to put a generic, catch-all answer to that. If I were you, I would address that very specifically with the therapist. And if you're not getting good answers, right? If that therapist is not able to answer your question in a way that makes you think, oh, okay, that made sense, then maybe looking for another therapist. And I tell my own families that, listen, we're all humans, and not every child is going to love me, right? And not every family is going to connect with me. Find the one you connect with that makes a difference.
Awesome. Thank you, Beth. I don't see any other questions. Kelly, do you have anything coming through on yours?
I don't. I am going to stop the recording just in case that might be discouraging anybody from
Asking.
sharing a question. So let me stop that.